What is up, y'all? It's Amin. Today, I'm going to be talking about the history of the Native Americans up until the Civil War. Did you know there are 5.2 million Native Americans living in the United States today? That's a whole lot of Native Americans. Look at this map of Manhattan, which, by the way, is a Native American word. See all these parallel streets, very boxy and organized? Except for this one exception. It's called Broadway. You may have heard of it. It used to be a Native American trail. Also, did you know that our very own Constitution was heavily influenced by the Iroquois tribe? These contributions by the Native Americans cannot go unnoticed. Their history is so important to their culture, and we need to respect that. We are making the same mistakes today that we made centuries ago. Let's learn about some Native American history!
The history of the Native Americans in America starts around 35,000 years ago during the Ice Age. Many of the world's oceans were solidified during this time, including the Bering Sea, which separates Alaska from Siberia today. This formed a land bridge which allowed many of the tribes that were living in Siberia to cross over to Alaska. Following migratory herds, many tribes crossed the land bridge over time. By the time the Europeans came in 1492, there were over 54 million people living in the Americas. Speaking of 1492, this is the next monumental date in the history of the Native Americans. Looking for a cheaper way to import exotic goods in order to please the European sweet tooth, Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean and landed on islands in the Bahamas. The implications of this historic encounter, also known as the Columbian Exchange, were vital to the history of the Native Americans. Let's take a closer look at the Columbian Exchange. While many things were exchanged between the two worlds, most would say that the New World got the worst end of the deal. The Europeans gave the New World many diseases, including smallpox and measles. Disease foreshadowed what would happen to the Native Americans as time went on. When the first Englishmen came to the Americas in the James River area, the relations between the English and the Native American were strained. When Governor Lord de la Warr received orders to attack the Indians, it set off the First Anglo-Powhatan War. The Native Americans' villages were burned and their provisions confiscated. Luckily, a man named John Rolfe fell in love with Pocahontas and the war ended. The second time around, things didn't go as well. In the Second Anglo-Powhatan War, the Native Americans made an attempt to dislodge the Virginians. John Rolfe was killed, their attempts failed, and it basically banished those Native Americans from their ancestral lands. By 1969, only 2,000 Indians remained in Virginia. The things that hurt the Native Americans the most were the 3 Ds: disease, disorganization, and disposability. The Native Americans, particularly in New England, were extremely susceptible to maladies, lacked unity to make effective opposition, and served no function for the English colonists. The 3 Ds were evident in the Pequot War, where the land-hungry English colonists arrived and set fire to the Indian wigwams. The Indians were defeated and many tribes were annihilated. The Indians pushed back in King Philip's War, but never again posed a major threat to the colonists. During the French and Indian War, different Native American tribes took alliances with either side. When the British won the war, the tribes that sided with the French were cut off by the British and effectively destroyed. Meanwhile, the Native Americans that sided with the British, who had an understanding that there would be no more encroachment to their land, were horrified when new colonists began to move in. This led to Pontiac's uprising, where the Native American chief Pontiac laid siege to Detroit to drive the British out. The British destroyed the Native Americans, and even used tactics like distributing smallpox-infected blankets among them. The land-hungry colonists were free to move even more west across the Appalachian Mountains. The American Revolution also had a devastating effect on the Native Americans. Most of the Native Americans sided with the British because they expected them to win the war and give them their land back. When the Americans won, the Americans forced the Native Americans to sign the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, where the Native Americans gave up most of their land. In the early years of the new nation under George Washington, the Native Americans were being armed by the lingering British, and this made the Americans furious. In the Battle of the Fallen Timbers, the British refused to shelter their Miami allies, and the Miamis were eventually forced to sign the Treaty of Greenville. They gave up most of their land in exchange for $20,000. They hoped this would put some limits on what the U.S. government could do to them in the future, but as we know, it didn't. While fevers against the British ran high just before the War of 1812, the Native Americans were being completely slaughtered. The anti-British war hawks wanted to completely destroy the native population because they were threatening pioneer settlers. Two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and the Prophet, decided enough was enough. They gathered many tribes together and scared the war hawks to death. Tensions flared and came to a point at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where William Henry Harrison became a hero. The dream of a native nation died along with Tecumseh. The most famous oppressive action by the U.S. government against the Indians is now known as the Trail of Tears. This was centered around the Indian Removal Act, which was signed by Andrew Jackson, and it led to the uprooting of more than 100,000 Native Americans. Jackson even promised that the natives would be permanently free of white encroachment, but that promise only lasted 15 years. However, some tribes resisted eviction. In the Black Hawk War, the Sauk and Fox tribes were bloodily crushed by Federal troops, including Lieutenant Jefferson Davis and none other than Captain Abraham Lincoln. The trend of the white man's problem devastating the Native Americans continued in the Civil War. While most sided with the Confederacy, all of the natives were screwed over no matter which side they were on. The history of the Native Americans needs to be recognized so we can stop building things like the Dakota Pipeline and calling football teams Redskins, which screw over natives just like they were screwed over so many times before.